ringing, oh, won't it be wonderful there?
This evening we're going to start a 3-lesson series more specific on the subject of evolution. It began with a 20-minute talk when I was a senior in undergraduate school at Stephen F. Austin. I took a course in which we all had to give 2 lectures, 20 minutes. And I gave a lecture on paleontological evidence against evolution. And you have to know my professor was a very devout evolutionist. And so there were certain things that he didn't appreciate about that, but I thought it was important to do it. And as I was leaving the biology building and going to the university center, there was a young man that was in my class, and he said, "Slow down, I want to talk to you." And he ran up to me and he put his arm up on my shoulder, and he said, "You know, I'm about to graduate, and I have a job teaching biology in high school this next year." He said, "Until today, I had never heard that there was an option other than evolution for how we got here. This is totally news to me, but you've impressed me with what you've said from science." And he said, "I'm going to make you a promise. When I teach high school biology, I'm going to teach both sides of the story." You see, there are some people that have just never heard it. And so it's important for us to know the truth and to share the truth of those who have open hearts. So we continue to ask this question when it comes to creation evidences, which is right, the Bible or is it man? And tonight we want to talk about science versus evolution's dating of the earth. And we're going to specifically answer 2 questions. Number 1, does it matter? And number 2, what about radiometric dating? Very important to answer that question because people think the radiometric dating just puts this to without question, that radiometric dating has showed that this universe is extremely old. Well, we want to address that, and you want to understand it before we're through. In Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, we see where Moses is giving the 10 Commandments. And it says in verse 8, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all of thy work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath unto Jehovah thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor the stranger that's within thy gates. For in 6 days Jehovah made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Now the meaning of this passage is just pretty straightforward. But evolutionists have convinced a majority that it took longer than 6 days for the universe to form. I think I mentioned the other day that Martin Luther's contemporaries thought that the world was actually shorter than 6 days in its beginning, in its creation, because they said God's so powerful he wouldn't need 6 days to do this. So people, I guess, have argued about these 6 days, shorter or longer, for a long time. So many people want to make these days of Genesis 1 and Exodus 20 meaning something more than a day, meaning long periods of time. And they try to rationalize that these word days in the Bible mean other things. So it's almost as if God's talking to the people there in the wilderness as he gives them the 10 Commandments. And he says, you know, in 6 days you're going to labor, and then you're going to have this Sabbath day. Why? Because I took 6 billion years to make it. And then I rested for 1 billion years. Yeah, it's not very logical because you don't change the definition of a word in the middle of a sentence. But that's exactly what people would have us to believe. Kind of like advertising your business is open 6 billion years a week. God defines a week in Exodus 20, and it's not in the billions, it's days. Yet when you go to school, and it doesn't matter how early you start, in elementary school, sometimes right there at kindergarten and first grade, there's an introduction to evolution. And you see books like this that talk about 30 million years ago. And let me tell you, usually when you're looking at a science book and they're going and they're talking about that kind of years, that about 30 million years ago, larger primates such as monkeys and apes evolved. The earliest fossil apes that may be ancestral to both humans and modern apes date from about 15 to 20 million years. When you see this terminology, what I believe that you're usually seeing is a fairy tale. Long ago and far away is how many fairy tales start. And I believe, and I'm going to show you, why I believe that science shows that this is a fairy tale. The long days or the long eons of time is a fairy tale. And the idea that we evolved from a lemur or any other kind of primate, that's a fairy tale. No matter how many years you might want to factor in. So you see these textbooks telling kids, you're an animal and share a common heritage with earthworms. Well, that gives them something to live up to, doesn't it? But that's what's being taught in our schools. The evolutionary view of history is this. It's some 10 to 20 billion years ago, everything in this universe, all of the planets with their suns or stars, all of the galaxies were all condensed into this cosmic egg. This piece of matter that's smaller than a single proton. The gravity just held it in. And then there was the Big Bang. The gravity released and it just exploded and went far away from every other piece of matter in the universe. And then with that, our solar system began to evolve about 5 billion years ago, with the Earth evolving about 4.6 billion years ago. Single-cell organisms evolving on the Earth about 3 to 4 billion years ago. Multi-cell organisms in the last 1 billion years. Humankind evolving, and people argue about this, whether it's 1 to 3 or sometimes as far out as 7 or 8 million years. And then modern civilization being here in the last 5 to 10,000 years. I think that is a significant number. They use the geologic time scale to try to show that we can just dig down into the layers of sediment and see the history of the Earth. And with this, they will show the index fossils that they say are key for certain periods of time. Evolutionists believe that time is important. You see, evolutionists believe that time actually performs miracles. Professor George Wald, who is a Nobel Prize-winning biology professor at Harvard, said time is in fact the hero of the plot, given so much time, the impossible. He refers to evolution as impossible. Impossible. But give them time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles. So they realize that there's so many things scientifically going against the theory of evolution. There are no transitional forms in the fossil record from one kind to another distinct kind. Yeah, don't worry about that, because we can sweep that problem under the rug of just give us enough time. There's no mechanism to explain evolution. The design of living things really goes against evolution. And as we've begun to talk about, and we're going to continue to look at it, the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, speaks against evolution. But give them time, and all those problems just seem to be swept under the rug. Now, time does not minimize the problems of evolution. Even if there's been 15 to 20 billion years, there's not been enough time for evolution to occur. I also want you to know, when evolutionists are talking about billions of years, that's what they believe they've got to have in order to have evolution. Now, you and I see the word millions, and we think that's a big number. And it is big. But an evolutionary way of thinking, millions is a short period of time. And if all you had was millions, that's not enough time. No evolutionists would accept just millions. They believe that we've had to be here for billions of years for evolution to even be remotely possible. Now, because of science, many preachers in all different religions, including preachers in churches of Christ, have compromised what the scriptures plainly teach. And they have done it by coming up with different false theories to try to re-explain the plain scriptures. One theory is what's called the gap theory. And they theorize that this earth was here for long periods of time. And during these long periods of time, there was a lot of sediment. These sedimentary layers were just laid down upon each other. And if you look at the world, it just looked old. But here's the deal. They say, you don't read this from Scripture, they say that Satan fell. God grabbed him, if you will, by the nape of the neck and threw him to the earth, so that when he hit the earth, it just destroyed the earth. And what you read about in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is how God recreated the earth for the second time. And he made it on top of all that other stuff that had been here for millions and millions of years. That's the gap theory. And so what they try to do is take all of these sedimentary layers and just somewhat kind of cram them in between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and the next few verses. You can't read Genesis 1 and get that story. But here's another one. The progressive creation theory. It claims the days of Genesis 1 are literal days. But they're only days of announcement. There used to be an elder who went about the country teaching the theory of evolution through this, the progressive creation theory. He called this seminar series the Lord I Believe series. And when I was trying to wrap my head around this many years ago, I contacted him by email. And I said, you know, it seems like to me that you're talking long periods of time. And you're even going into churches, especially in the children's classes, because he'd bring a team of people with him. And in the children's classes, what they would do is they'd pass out the geologic time scale and talk to the kids in Bible class about how old the universe was. I said, I don't understand. People are questioning you, and you say, oh yeah, I believe the days of Genesis 1 are literal. How do you have literal days in Genesis 1 and at the same time get in these long periods of time? He said, well, what you don't understand is those are just announcement days. I said, say what? He said, yeah, on day 1 in Genesis 1, God just announced what he was going to do, and then it'd take a long period of time. And then when it says the second day, God just announced what he was going to do, and it took a long period of time. I continued to ask him questions. And I said, you know what? It seems like to me what you believe is stellar evolution. And then at the point of life, you believe in progressive creation, where God over these long periods of time would then create these things. He said, that's exactly what I believe, but if you tell people that I'm a theistic evolutionist, I'm going to resent it. He's not by himself. This is a very common theory. There's a lot of people that believe in what they call the progressive creation theory. And so again, these days you read about in Genesis 1 are just announcement days, and they work in these vast periods of time in that chapter. And then there's the day-age theory, a very common theory that when you're reading Genesis chapter 1, when it says a day, it's not a day, it's just a vast period of time. And so that's another way that some preachers and theologians and academics will argue for long periods of time. You may even be familiar with that debate that took place about 25 years ago, a written debate where an academic, a Church of Christ preacher, argued the days of Genesis 1 cannot be literal. That was the proposition. They cannot be literal. Then there's the framework hypothesis theory. It's the idea that Genesis 1 is an allegory. And it doesn't really teach how God made it. Here's the story. They just want you to know from Genesis 1 that God had something to do with it. You can't read Genesis 1 and 2 and come up with these false theories. These are the most prominent false theories, but they're not even limited to these. There's more. And then there's some who ask, well, what difference does it make? Just as long as we teach the exact same plan of salvation, what does it matter if people teach this stuff? I'm glad you asked. We want to answer that question. It's a good question. The first problem all of these old earth theories have in common is they make the days of Genesis 1 figurative. And I just want to ask you, if you make those figurative when it's obviously written not in a figurative way, where's the stopping place? You could just make anything figurative, couldn't you? And actually, that's what some people do. They just make anything in the Bible that kind of goes against what they're wanting to do, figurative, and then they do what they want to do. Some say, isn't it true that time doesn't mean anything to God? I imagine some of you have heard that. When people ask me that, I go, no, there's nowhere in the Bible that says that. They go, really? I think somewhere in the Bible it does, but I don't know where it is. And what they want you to do is they want you to provide the scripture for their misconcept. They say, doesn't the Bible say somewhere that in Bible time a day is 1,000 years? And I say, no, it doesn't say that. But because we're talking about this, I want you to look at the scripture they're referring to. It's 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 11, where it says, but forget not this one thing, beloved, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Doesn't say is, says as. Now, let me ask you, let's just substitute out as with an is. Which way do you want it? 1,000 years is a day, or a day is 1,000 years? You've got Adam who lived to be 930 years. So if 1,000 years is actually a day, well, he didn't even make it a whole day. You see, it's saying it on both sides. You need to read. That's one of the things that people don't do is they just don't read. But then you also need to read the context. The context is this: the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering to you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall be dissolved with fervent heat, and the earth and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Seeing it, these things are thus all to be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy living and godliness? What's he talking about? He's talking about the end time and judgment coming. And he's talking about the mind of God. So if this universe has been here 6 or maybe 7,000 years, and in the mind of God, it's like a week has taken place. He says, how should you be living? You know, I may forget things that happened a year or 2 or 3 ago, but I'll tell you what happened yesterday, I got a pretty decent handle on. And he says, if you understand that, you understand the mind of God is that perfect, where you're before him in judgment. He remembers everything that you've done. Genesis 1 defines a day. Look at verse 5. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there's evening and there's morning, one day. What's the definition of a day? It's an evening and a morning. And then we look again at Exodus chapter 20. He says, for in 6 days Jehovah made heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. How long did it take God to make the universe? He says 6 days. First of all, he's showing the people in the wilderness, the Israelite people who have just left Egypt, that just like you know what a week is like, and you're going to have a work week that's 6 days long, just like that, God used 6 days to create the world. These days like you have in the wilderness. But not only that, when you look at the word day in the Hebrew language, it's the word yom. It's found 2,291 times, and it's almost always used literally. And when it's used with an ordinal number, not a cardinal number is like 1, 2, 3, 4. An ordinal number is like first, second, third, and fourth. When it's used with an ordinal number, no exception, the word day is always literal. And that's exactly what you see in Genesis chapter 1. The second day, the third day, the fourth day. Those are literal days. But not only that, we're looking here in Exodus 20, he's using the word days, plural, and that's the Hebrew word yamim, found 845 times in the Old Testament, and without exception, always literal, never figurative. So when he says he made the world in 6 days, he's telling us there are 6 literal days like you and I know. The second problem these old earth theories have in common is they redefine God. Throughout the Bible, in the Old and the New Testament, God is described as being the creator, which refers back to the description of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. We look at Acts chapter 4 and verse 24. And what does it say? And when they heard that, they lifted up their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, thou art God, which made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Who do we pray to? The God that made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. We pray to the God of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and these New Testament scriptures over and over again refer back to Genesis 1 and 2. Acts chapter 14, verse 15, the Apostle Paul with his traveling companion Barnabas talk about who the true God is, the living God that made what? The heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are therein. He's referring back to Genesis 1. That's how you define God, the God of creation. Acts 17, 23 through 24. He goes to Mars Hill, to the Areopagus. And here we see on this hill there in Athens, there's all these people wanting to hear new things. And he says, you know, I notice that you have all of these different idols, and you worship one that's the unknown God. He said, that's the God I worship. But he's not unknown to me. I want to tell you about him. And he starts defining God in verse 24. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in the temples made with hands. New Testament scriptures refer back to Genesis 1 over and over again. Revelation 14, 6 through 7, the angel is shouting about the everlasting gospel, and it's the God that made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of the waters. God is defined by creation. Third problem these old earth theories have in common is they contradict Jesus in Mark chapter 10 and verse 6. They do so by making man a recent newcomer to the planet. You see, Jesus said in Mark 10:6, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. We're in the creation now. We live in the creation. Jesus says at the beginning of the creation, he made male and female. He made Adam and Eve. But I want you to think about this. If this universe is about 20 billion years ago, and even if man was made in the last 1 to 3 million years, like the evolutionists say, do you know that would put man on this planet in only the last 0.005 to 0.015% of the time? That makes us a newcomer, not someone who's been here from the beginning of the creation. So in this way, they make Jesus Christ a liar. Here's a fourth problem. the old earth theories have in common. They make Jesus Christ, the Apostle Paul, out to be liars, since Jesus and Paul refer to the creation as a literal historic event. Mark 13:19, for in those days shall be affliction, which was not from the beginning of the creation. 1 Timothy 2:13 through 14, Paul talks about Adam and Eve. And then in 1 Corinthians 11:8 and 9, again, Paul is talking about how the woman was made for the man, Adam and Eve. Jesus and Paul, they knew that Genesis 1 and 2 were literal. So what difference does it make? Well, in John 3:12, it says, if I told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you believe if I tell you heavenly things? So it's just a matter if we're going to believe Jesus, if we're going to believe the Bible. And with that in mind, as I pointed this out the other day, there's been a survey that Ken Ham and his associates made to find out why children are leaving churches. And here is the issue. It's really not the issue of evolution as much as the issue of the age of the earth. That's why young people, because they've been taught the earth is old, and they know obviously the Bible teaches the opposite. That by the time they're through intermediate school, they basically are left. They've checked out. They may even sit in the pew with you, but they're gone. And he lists all different kinds of churches, including churches of Christ. Brethren, it's time for us to get really serious about this issue. I know you're serious about it, but there's a lot of places where people aren't. And we need to be serious about this issue of the age of the earth. So I want to tell you, I, with a large number of scientists, believe the world is probably about 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And I tend to lean between 6,000 and 7,000. I think the Bible indicates it, but I also think science indicates it. The Bible seems to indicate a young earth, not billions of years old. And the second thing is the scientific evidence is much more consistent with a very young earth that involves a worldwide flood than it is with a universe that's billions of years old. So let's talk about how people come up with these old time spans. An evolutionist is trying to figure out how old things are, and there's two main methods that they use. One is what's called relative dating. And so let me explain what it is. They pick up a stone, and in the stone there are fossils. And they say, you know, this fossil is 300 million years old. And you say, well, how do you know that? And they say, well, we know that because this fossil is in a layer of sediment that is 300 million years old. So you go down the hall to the geologist, the guy who is the rock expert, and you say, I understand that this stone, this sediment is 300 million years old. How do you know that? He goes, well, that's easy. There's a fossil in it that's 300 billion years old. Now you see where we're going? So you go down to the paleontologist, that's the fossil expert. How do you know this fossil is 300 million years old? He says, well, because the rock is 300 million years old, because the geologist tells us that. See, it's circular reasoning. And I don't want you to think I'm making this up on them. Let's look at what some evolutionists, famous evolutionists, have said. Tom Kemp says a circular argument arises. Interpret the fossil record in terms of a particular theory of evolution, inspect the interpretation, and note that it confirms the theory. Well, it would, wouldn't it? David Kitts, University of Oklahoma, said the record of evolution, like any other historical record, must be construed within a complex of particular and general preconceptions, not the least of which is the hypothesis that evolution has occurred. You've got these preconceptions that you're working with, and one of them is that, evolution happened, and you have this relative dating where you come up with these long periods of time. Niles Eldredge, he's not only a famous evolutionist, he's a famous writer. You can go to Barnes & Noble and buy his books. And it says, and this poses something of a problem. If we date the rocks by the fossils, how can we then turn around and talk about patterns of evolutionary change through time in the fossil record? You see, these gentlemen are admitting to the circular reasoning. So one way is the relative dating method, and then the other one is what they call the absolute method. Now, don't misunderstand. They don't mean absolute with the idea that you can go and go, okay, this is back, it dates back to May the 9th and then a certain year. That's not what we're saying. They believe this is a more objective way to come up with dates for various things. So let me show you what I've got up here. I've got up here radioactive decay. There are certain elements, chemical elements, that are radioactive and they give off particles. So for an example, uranium-238, it gives off an alpha particle, which is essentially helium, and it becomes thorium-234, which becomes protactinium-234, which becomes uranium-234, and then it gives off an alpha particle, and it becomes thorium-230. And this all continues to deteriorate until it comes down to lead-206, and lead is very stable. So if you're looking at something, it has these elements in it. Then the thought is, since we can calculate the half-life of this deterioration, we can figure out how old they are. I want to make sure I'm clear. We can very accurately determine the half-life of these elements that are deteriorating. That's not the issue. I was having a Bible study one time with a friend of mine. He was an evolutionist, and he just wouldn't listen. He just kept going. But David, we can calculate this. I'm going, yeah, I understand. I'm agreeing with you. But David, we can calculate this. I said, I understand. We can calculate. That's not the issue. So what we do, when you think about, say, uranium-238, and then it ultimately becoming lead-206, that's like having a parent and then you're having a child. And so we refer to these elements with this kind of terminology. We have the daughter element and we've got the parent element. So concerning radiometric dating, you need to know this. Number one, radiometric dating is not used for sedimentary rocks like limestone and sandstone, but it's used for igneous rocks, which are once molten liquid rock. Now, when you look at the geologic time scale, what do you see? You see layers of sedimentary rock, sandstone, limestone, but it's all sediment. A number of years ago, I was preaching a meeting on evidences in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And we didn't have anything lined up during the day, and the preacher took me to the Mammoth Caves. And we're down in the Mammoth Caves, and we're stopping, and the geologist, who's our tour guide, he is showing us around, and he's telling us that we're under this layer that was several 100 million years old. And the preacher nudged me. I raised my hand. He said, "You got a question?" I said, "Yeah." "How do you know that?" And he goes, "Well, we know that from radiometric dating. We use radiometric dating to determine how old these sedimentary layers are." Do you realize that radiometric dating is not used for sediment? The guy went ballistic. I mean, he really did. Got really upset. I'm not looking for a fight. And so I just didn't say anything more. We went and finished the tour. We got out. We're going to the preacher's truck. To that guy's credit, he came running after me, and I was wondering, okay, now what's going to happen? But no, he was coming to apologize. He said, "Sir, so you obviously know a lot more about this than I do." He said, "I only have a bachelor's degree in geology." And I looked at him and I said, "I'm not trying to embarrass you. I thought you might have had another way in which you're dating this stuff." I said, "But I'm going to just tell you, you don't have to have a master's or a PhD in geology. What I just said to you tonight and what I told him, that's in all freshman geology books. A first-year geology will tell you this. So this is not heavy-duty geology. You don't use radiometric dating to date sediment. Now, you young people, when you go to school, I'm not telling you to embarrass your teachers. I'm really not. I don't want you to get in an argument with it. But I want you to know this. When they're telling you that radiometric dating is dating these geologic columns, you just mark it down right here. No. Scientists don't do that on sediment. The issue about radiometric dating is not about our ability to measure the rate of decay. It's with the assumptions that are made. So I want to talk to you about how you date a system or an object. First of all, you observe the present state of the system. Well, that makes sense. You're going to look at what you got. And then next thing is you're going to measure the process rate within the system. And then the third thing is you're going to make assumptions about the past. And the fourth thing you're going to do is you're going to calculate the time necessary for that process to produce the present state. Now let's talk about the assumptions. You're going to assume that you've had a constant rate of decay. And that is an assumption. Number two, you're going to assume a closed system, that you don't have any gain or loss of parent or daughter elements. And thirdly, you're going to assume how much was there or not there at the very beginning, the starting conditions. Now, I'm going to make this easy. Let's say that you come back to the Houston area on an airplane, it's raining. So you go home and you look at your rain gauge and you ask yourself, because you can see water in the rain gauge, I wonder how long it's been raining. That's the same question that scientists are asking when they look at a particular rock and trying to figure out how old it is. So here's how we do it. We look at the rain gauge. The first thing is we're just going to analyze the system where it is right now. And we've got 2 inches of rain in the rain gauge. Secondly, we're going to measure the process rate of the system. So for the next hour, we're going to watch it rain, and we're going to get another inch. And we're going to realize the rate of the rainfall is an hour per inch. And then we're going to go to step 4, and we're going to calculate the time necessary for that process to produce the observed condition. So the rate was an hour for an inch. And we started out with 2 inches, and the question is, how long had it been raining before we look at the rain gauge? And you come up with the answer, yeah, about 2 hours. Anybody have any questions? Some of y'all probably noticed I skipped step number 3. And some of you are probably going, it doesn't always rain the same amount. In fact, it's so terrible. We've had this hurricane go through the eastern United States and tear so many things up. And so rain can come down slowly, and the same storm, it can come down quickly, and it can come down really quickly, and it can slow down. And y'all all know, because you've seen rain, that it's not always just a constant rate. But I'll tell you, when I lived in Portland, Oregon, sometimes it was just a constant mist all the time, but not always. So is that the correct age of the system? Well, I skipped over the assumptions. So assumption number 1 was we had a constant decay rate. In other words, a constant amount of rainfall. You measured the process for a period of time after you looked at the rain gauge. So scientifically, you really don't know how fast it was raining during that 2-inch period. Before you were starting the measuring, could have been more slowly in its rainfall, more quickly, and it could have been the same rate, but we don't know. We just have to make an assumption. Now the second thing is we've got to assume a closed system, that there's been no gain or loss of a parent or daughter element. You know, if you've got a rain gauge over here, and I'm friends with people in our town who are very involved with conservation. And they have different rain gauges, some that you can put down low to the ground and different things. Let's say you have your rain gauge. where there is a sprinkler system that can also add to it. So it's not just the rain, but it's also the sprinkler system. Would that affect our calculations? Well, certainly it would. And then if some friendly, helpful fella came along and drained your rain gauge, that would affect your calculation. So we got to assume none of this is happening. And the third thing is we got to assume that this rainstorm we're talking about started with an empty rain gauge, or at least we knew exactly how much rain was in there. You see, these are the assumptions you make in radiometric dating: a constant rate of decay, a closed system, and the initial conditions are known. Now, it's not necessarily wrong for scientists to speculate about this, but I really think they ought to use a little more humility when it comes to trying to present this information instead of saying we absolutely know it to be that way. Unfortunately, that's what they do, though. They say, well, we know it's this many millions or even billions of years old. The fourth assumption is a real Achilles heel to radiometric dating, because if daughter elements are present at the start, then the system starts out looking really old. So in practice, how does it work? Well, how are you going to figure out how it works? It's kind of like I used to be involved with my kids wrestling, and I knew a guy who calibrated scales. And you know how you calibrate a scale? You take a weight, you know how much it weighs, you put it on the scale, you make sure it says that, and if not, you correct the scale. So the way to do this is you use these methods on rock that we know how old they are. That makes sense, wouldn't it? So we go out to northern Arizona, Sunset Crater, and you look at the lava, and there's Indian artifacts in the lava. The Indians tell a story that this erupted about 900 years ago. And you look at the tree ring dating of the trees that are in the lava flow, and they date back to about 1065 AD. So about 900 years old. However, when we use potassium argon dating, that lava dates to 210,000, 230,000 years old. So the question is this: we already know how old the rock pretty much is. Is the radiometric dating working? Go to Mount Rangitoto in New Zealand. Potassium argon dates the lava at almost 500,000 years old. But another form of radiometric dating, radiocarbon, dates the trees in the lava is only 300 years old. So which one is it? And then you go to the Kwapalehu flow in Hawaii. And this lava flow was witnessed in 1800 to 1801. And it's supposed to be too young to produce radiogenic argon or helium, and both gases are found in large quantities. So different dating methods were used. 12 dates determined for this same flow of lava, and the dates were anywhere between 140 million years to almost 3 billion years old. Averaged out, that'd be about 1.4 billion. Got a question? We know how old it is. 200 years old. You got a lot of confidence in radiometric dating that dated it a whole lot older than that. Mount Kilauea, active volcano in Hawaii. Potassium argon dates the very same lava flow at 3 different depths down in the ocean. So you go down to about 4,680 meters, and it dates it 21 million years, plus or minus 8. You come up to 3,420 meters, it dates at 12 million years old, give or take 2. 1,400 meters of depth in the ocean, and it dates out 0, brand new, and we know that's what it is. So does it work when you know how old the rocks are? Radiocarbon is the same. The troubles radiocarbon dating methods are undeniably deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged, and warnings are out that radiocarbon may soon find itself in a crisis situation. Continuing use of the method depends on a fix-it-as-we-go approach, allowing for contamination here, fractionation there, and calibration whenever possible. It should be no surprise then that fully half of the dates are rejected. The wonder is surely that the remaining half have come to be accepted. I've listened to a scientist talk about this, being in the laboratory where they're dating the different rocks, and they would get a date and they'd throw that date out and get another date and throw it out. And he says, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, we already know how old the rocks are. We got to just keep on running this until we get the date we're looking for." My upbringing doesn't call that science. No matter how useful it is, though, the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results. There are gross discrepancies, the chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are actually selected dates. So, when we know how old the rocks are, it doesn't seem to work, but we need to be believing it when we don't know ahead of time how old they are. That's what they tell us, I believe. So you got any questions? Yeah, here's my question. Are there any other ways to date the earth? Look at population statistics. The present population growth rate is about 2%. And in spite of all the things that have gone on for centuries, like famines and plagues and wars with mass weaponry and brutal genocide and rampant abortion, the population rate has actually been pretty stable. So start with an original couple. We might call them Adam and Eve. Or we might call them Mr. and Mrs. Noah. Reproduce as to increase the population by 2% a year. It only take about 1,100 years to have the present world population of about 7 billion. That's a young earth, isn't it? Just for the sake of argument, if modern man has been around for 1 million years, with the present population growth rate of 2%, do you know there'd be 1 times 10 to the 8,600 power number of people on this planet? Where would you put them all? For the sake of arguments, look at it a different way. If modern man's been around for only 1 million years, the population growth rate to produce today's population of 7 billion from an original couple would be only 0.002%. That's 0.002%. That's doubling the population only every 35,000 to 36,000 years. So you start off with Mr. and Mrs. Noah, and you just don't get any population doubling for 35,000 years. So now we're up to 4, and then you have it double again 35,000 years later, we're up to 8. Is that reasonable? But that's what it would take mathematically to come up with the dates that they're giving us. In this example of combining old Earth theory with evolutionary uniformitarianism reasonable, calculate any way you want. Population statistics indicates a young Earth. What about the decay of the Earth's magnetic field? If you're familiar with the Earth's magnetic field, it's a very important field around our Earth. It deflects a lot of radiation, so it doesn't come all the way into the Earth and radiate us even more than we are. Precise measurements of the Earth's magnetic field have been taken since 1829 AD. And the half-life of its decay is 1,400 years. The evidence indicates the decay has been uniform since its recorded history. At 20,000 BC, the Earth's internal structure would be disrupted by the heat generated. Just go back 20,000 years, and this magnetic field would generate so much heat it would destroy the Earth. So let me tell you, if I wasn't a believer, if I didn't believe in God, I couldn't look at science like this and believe in an ancient Earth. I might not be able to explain a young Earth, but I couldn't believe with science that the Earth is actually really old. Now I will tell you, there is no scientific evidence that this magnetic field is ever reversed. But evolutionary scientists say we believe it had to have had. Why is that? Well, because we know the Earth is really old. And you just can't keep it going this direction and have an old Earth. We don't have any evidence of that except not wanting to believe that the earth is young. You go back 100,000 years, and the heat generated by this magnetic field in the earth would make the heat of this planet equivalent of a neutron star. A star about 10 miles in diameter putting off tremendous amount of heat. How old is the earth? Well, the decay of the Earth's magnetic field indicates a pretty young one. You look at the age of the atmosphere. We talked about radiometric dating being based upon radioactive decay and helium being put off. You know what? Start with no helium in our atmosphere. And just by the present process of helium being generated, we could come up to what the amount of helium we have today in just 2 million years. That doesn't indicate an old Earth, 4.6 billion years ago, but a young Earth. And yet I believe that God, no doubt, put helium in our atmosphere from the beginning. The accumulation of the ocean sediments. At present rates, all the sediment in the ocean would accumulate no more than 14 million years. The blanket of sediment on the ocean floor averages about 1,200 feet thick. However, if the oceans are 1 billion years old, like the evolutionists tell us, the sediment should be 100,000 feet thick. Why isn't it like that? It's because the Earth's not that old. But then you might be thinking, well, why is it as thick as it is if we believe that the Earth's probably 6,000, 7,000 years old? That's a great question, and it's got a simple answer. It's called the worldwide flood. Generated a tremendous amount of sediment, and we'll talk about that more to come. The erosion of the continents. At the present rates, the continents would all be eroded in no more than 14 million years. So why do we still have continents with mountains on them? You can start out with distilled water in the oceans. But we know there's salt water. But start out with distilled water. You know the present process of putting salt in the oceans would only take 62 million years to have the salt in the oceans that we have today? According to evolutionists, that's a young Earth, not an old. But yet I believe because of the life that we see in the oceans, God no doubt created the oceans with salt. And think of this. Galaxies wind themselves up way too fast to be billions of years old. The stars of the Milky Way galaxy rotate around the galactic center with different speeds, with the inner ones rotating faster than the outer ones. The rotational speeds are so fast that if our galaxy was more than a few hundred million years, it would be a featureless disk of stars instead of its present spiral shape. Yet evolutionists teach that our galaxy is at least 10 billion years old. Evolutionists call this the winding up dilemma, and they have known about this for over 50 years. It speaks to a young Earth, not an old Earth. I believe that time is running out on the evolutionists. It's running out on the theory of evolution. There's just not the time, from what we can see, to explain what this Earth looks like. So we are glad to defend our beliefs. John 8:32 says, the truth shall make you free. Psalm 33 verses 6 through 9 says, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them. By the breath of his mouth he gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap. He layeth up the depth in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood forth. Do you conclude with me that evolutionists don't have the dating of the earth right? I think the evidence is pretty plain. Tomorrow night we're going to talk about science versus evolution. We're going to show some strong evidence from science that evolution just can't be so. And then we're going to do it again on Friday night. And we're going to, in addition to that, we're going to look at why you cannot believe in God and also believe in evolution. The two don't go together. And it does make a difference. But I ask you this by way of invitation this evening. If you're here and you're not yet a Christian and you'd like to become one, this is a great night to become a Christian. There's no time like the present. Why not do it now? Why not accept Jesus as Lord and Savior by doing what Jesus has asked us to do, to believe in Him with all of our heart, to turn away from our sins, confess our faith, and be baptized for the remission of sins. If you're here this evening and you'd like to do that, we'd like to accommodate you. Why don't you just come forward as we stand and sing the invitation song.